Many Canadians associate the Ku Klux Klan with the tragic days of segregation in the United States. But for more than a century, the Klan had a presence here in Canada too. As Allan Bartley's new book chronicles, it's called The Ku Klux Klan in Canada, a century of promoting racism and hate in the Peaceable Kingdom. Allan Bartley is an adjunct professor in the Department of Political Science at Carleton University and a former intelligence analyst. And he joins us now from the nation's capital. It's good to meet you, Professor Bartley. How are you doing?
Very good. Thanks very much.
Not at all. Let's do an excerpt from the book and then we'll dive in. Hate, you write, has a name. Hate has a face. Hate has an address. It lives in Canada. The Ku Klux Klan's more than 100-year presence in Canada demonstrates how hate lived and flourished in the nation, sometimes known as the Peaceable Kingdom. Our neighbors were partly to blame, but Canadians can also blame themselves. That is going to come as news to a lot of people. Before I picked up the book, myself included, I never knew that people with white sheets and so on ran around the streets of Toronto and beyond. Why did you want to tell this story?
The story came to me rather than me going to seek the story. I had done some research on the Klan back in the late 1990s while I was in graduate school. And I did an academic article at the time on the Klan in Ontario, and I basically put that work aside and left it. And then we have the election of Donald Trump in the United States. We have the march in Charlottesville in Virginia in 2017. And I was asked if I was interested in going back and looking at the Klan again for purposes of a book. And initially, I have to say I was reluctant. This is not a topic on which I'd chosen to spend any time academically speaking or intellectually speaking. But as I looked at what was going on in the United States and I recalled the impact that the Klan had in Ontario, I realized that if there was going to be a time to examine the history of the Klan in Canada, this was probably it. So I undertook to further my research and produce the book that you've seen and referred to.
Yes, indeed. Now, how and when did the Klan first arrive in Canada?
The Klan arrived cinematographically, if I can put it that way, in the sense that a movie called The Birth of a Nation, which is quite famous historically, arrived in Canada in the fall of 1915. The Birth of a Nation was essentially a glorification of the Ku Klux Klan and the spirit of a defeated Confederacy. It essentially told the story, which is based on fact, of the creation of the Ku Klux Klan as a vigilante organization established by former Confederate soldiers, white soldiers, to impose some sort of order as they saw it on freed blacks in the southern United States. The Klan itself at the time was eventually outlawed by the United States government and went underground for the rest of the 19th century. But with the arrival of The Birth of a Nation and the movie and the story it told, the Klan breathed a new life in the 20th century. And the film, when it arrived in Toronto and when it arrived in all the other major cities across the country, played to very, very large crowds, lineups around the block to buy tickets in Toronto and elsewhere. And it was a feature of the theater world from coast to coast for 4 or 5 years and beyond, well into the 1920s. The Birth of a Nation played over and over and over again.
Now, the message of that motion picture certainly does not hold up all these years later, but the picture was considered landmark for its time. It obviously was a silent movie coming in before talkies. But just to be clear here, when the Klan eventually did have its presence in Canada, we think of the Ku Klux Klan as a bunch of guys with capes and white sheets on their heads and burning crosses. Is that the kind of Klan that came to Canada?
Absolutely. The Klan arrived in bits and pieces in the early 1920s. First, recruiters arrived piecemeal in 1920, 1921. The ground had already been prepared, if you will, by the images of Birth of a Nation. And so when recruiters started arriving in the lower mainland of British Columbia, in the Maritimes, in southern Ontario, there was a real appetite to see what this was about. Some people in southern Ontario arrived at recruiting meetings with their own homemade hoods. which sort of indicates that there was a desire to join up right away. So yes, the image that the Klan has always had of white hoods, of cloaks, of regalia, absolutely. All of it backlit with burning crosses.
And did they have much of a presence in, for example, in the province of Ontario?
We often think of the Klan in Canada as being primarily focused in the West and in Saskatchewan in particular. But in fact, the Klan in Ontario was an extremely large organization during the mid-1920s. There were rallies in cities and towns across the province where you would have 5, 10, 15, 20,000 participants. This is not something I think that's readily recognized. But if you go back and look at the newspaper accounts of the day, the Klan was a very, very large and popular organization, and it had a lot of adherents in the province of Ontario.
Now, you say a large organization, but would they, and public, would they have had, for example, a secret presence inside, city councils or the cabinet table or, federal politics, that kind of thing? Maybe not outwardly, but secretly.
There's some evidence that the Klan had members in municipal councils in places across the province. I'm thinking particularly the city of Guelph, where it was rumored that at least 2 or 3 of the councillors were secret Klan members. It was also rumored that some members of the Guelph Police Service were members of the Klan. In terms of overt members, no. That does not seem to have been a feature of political life in Ontario, and generally speaking, with one exception, or 2 exceptions rather, in other parts of the country. The Klan tended in the early days in Ontario to take on the trappings of the American Klan with cross burnings, with intimidation of Black people, with intimidation of Catholics, with intimidation of Jewish people, but it didn't have a directed political momentum. Now, that's not the case in Saskatchewan, to a lesser extent in New Brunswick, and to a certain extent in Alberta. There, the Klan had definite political goals, mostly driven by the leadership and for reasons which had to do with unique circumstances in those jurisdictions.
Now, of course, one of the most appalling things that the Klan did in the Deep South was the lynching of Blacks. Did that kind of thing happen here?
I have found no evidence of lynchings. There were certainly beatings. There was at least 2 kidnappings. There was 1 tarring and feathering. But the violence associated, and arson, and 1 bombing. But the violence that's associated with the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, by and large, did not come to pass in Canada. But there was certainly enough violence associated with the Klan in reality and in terms of the public animosities that they created, that they lived up to their reputation.
And again, in the United States, law enforcement certainly turned a blind eye to much of what they did. Many law enforcement officers, of course, secretly support and not so secretly supported the actions of the Klan. How about up here?
A different context. In Ontario and in Saskatchewan, the Ontario Provincial Police and the Saskatchewan Provincial Police mounted investigations against the Klan for a number of reasons. One, allegations of fraud and theft of membership monies. The second had to do with the potential threat of violence. So in those jurisdictions, the provincial police forces recruited human sources in the organization and had them report back to the police in those provinces. Nationally, the RCMP noted the presence of the Klan, but in New Brunswick, for example, and in Saskatchewan, virtually no sense that the RCMP were concerned or overly concerned about the presence or the activities of the Klan.
Now, we know they certainly wanted to make life miserable for Blacks here, for Jews, for Catholics, but what was their ultimate end goal?
We have to remember that in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan in Canada was primarily a commercial enterprise. The selling of membership, the selling and rental of robes and regalia, that was where the money was. And if the Klan was nothing else, it was a commercial enterprise. So from that point of view, the goal was fairly limited and short term. It capitalized on some inherent antipathies and hatreds that existed in Canada. And from there, we start to see the move into political arenas and the expression of political objectives having mostly to do with keeping Catholics out of political power, keeping French speakers from taking over or having a presence in the schools in particular, and essentially maintaining the status quo as it was seen in Ontario and other places in the country. So the political goals initially were quite limited. That's different than what happened in Saskatchewan, where as time went on in the late 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan contributed significantly to the defeat of the Liberal government of Jimmy Gardner and putting in place a conservative government that essentially gave the Klan everything that it was seeking in terms of anti-Catholic, anti-French, anti-Quebec objectives. So the political ambitions of the Klan in the West were much more clearly defined, not so much in the rest of the country. There were stories after the 1925 provincial election in New Brunswick, for example, that the Klan had been a significant contributor to the defeat of the Liberal government there. There's evidence that the Klan was certainly active on behalf of the Conservative Party, but I don't think it can be argued that the Klan was a decisive factor in that election, not as they were 4 or 5 years later in the Saskatchewan provincial election of 1929.
Okay, so you've got the Klan basically making its presence known in Canada about 100 years ago, having relatively more or less political influence in depending on what province they were in. When did the Ku Klux Klan start to decline in Canada?
The Klan was surprisingly active up until 1930 or so. With the advent of the Depression in 1929, there simply wasn't any money available for most people to join an organization like the Klan, which had fairly hefty membership dues for the time. And so the Klan went into decline into the early 1930s, replaced, if you will, by fascist groups that were aligned with the Nazi Party in Germany. By the time you get into the 1950s, 1960s, there's essentially no organized Klan in Ontario at all. There are sporadic outbreaks of brawls on walls and potentially threats against Black people, but not the kind of organization that we'd seen during the 1920s, early 1930s.
But a reemergence in the 1970s?
A reemergence in the 1970s. And I've looked at this quite closely, as have others. And it's a congruence, I think, of a number of things. The 1920s Ku Klux Klan was, as I say, largely a commercially driven organization. By the 1970s, early 1980s, ideology seems to have overtaken that motive amongst the Canadian organizers. There was a healthy dose of ego involved in the case of Canadian leaders. The Ku Klux Klan in the United States during the early 1980s was enjoying a revival, along with a number of other organizations on the extreme right wing, largely driven by ideology and religious motives that fall under the umbrella of Christian identity. And so you see a resurgence of these groups in the United States. You get echoes of that in Canada, and you see a short-lived resurgence of the Klan in 1980, 1981, 1982, 1983. By that point, most of the leaders in Canada were in jail for various criminal activities of one kind or another, including conspiracy to murder.
Let me pick up on that, because there is a crazy story, and I remember this very well because actually a guy I knew in Hamilton participated in this, believe it or not, when a bunch of Canadians went down to the Caribbean and they tried to essentially launch a coup on the island of Dominica. I guess this would have been the late 1970s, and it spectacularly failed. but it was, I mean, it was a harebrained, crazy idea that some people thought they could pull off. What role did the Klan have in all of that?
Yes, that is a harebrained scheme, which in retrospect looks like it was a fantasy. At the time, though, and in the political context of the late 1970s, early 1980s, there were some people that felt it had some chance of success. The original idea originated with an American in Texas. He peddled it to the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. The Klan in the United States peddled it to the two Canadians who were leading up the Klan in Canada, one of whom, Wolfgang Droege, actually was arrested along with a number of other people in Louisiana in the early 1980s, and spent time in jail as a result of this particular plan. There was some sense that it might have succeeded. The ideological orientation here was, we will take over this small island nation in the Caribbean. We will turn it into a criminal nation, if you will, a criminal state. We will make money by selling false passport or genuine passports to people who probably shouldn't have them. We will set up casinos. We will develop the island as a tourist attraction. We will make a lot of money, and we will turn the profits from these activities into the pursuit of white supremacist goals across North America and the world.
Wolfgang Droege, who you just mentioned there, actually made a bit of a comeback in another group. I think it was the Western Guard or the National Front or something like that. Heritage Front, thank you, that was it. And so I guess I want to know what kind of influence the Klan ultimately played on, what kind of influence did the Klan have on other hate groups that would emerge in the 1980s and beyond?
I think we can argue successfully that the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1980s was the incubator for some leadership figures like Wolfgang Droege and others who became involved in other organizations over the following decades, the Heritage Front being the most prominent and probably from a certain perspective the most successful, but even the Heritage Front came to nothing, primarily because of investigations by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which led to this disintegration of the Heritage Front. The leadership figures in the Heritage Front and other organizations got their start in the Ku Klux Klan. And so from that point of view, the Klan has had an enduring legacy in this country that I think we need to acknowledge. And that's why I think it's important that we recognize that the Klan has and had a significance far out of proportion to its numbers and its influence.
And what kind of presence does it have in Canada today?
Over the last 20 years, individuals and small groups of people across the country have presented themselves as being the Ku Klux Klan in Canada. That may have been true or not. It's really a question of what their affiliations were with the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, where it continues to be a viable organization. But the Ku Klux Klan in Canada, as far as I can determine at this time, is individuals and small groups who may or may not think they belong to the Klan and carry on some of the hateful, and I use the word deliberately, hateful ideologies that the Klan has peddled for more than 100 years.
Well, be that as it may, and let's finish up on this, I think one of the things that emerges from your book is the notion that hateful, violent, white supremacist groups, whether you want to call them the Ku Klux Klan or in more recent times by different names, well, look, they seem to have an ability to reconstitute themselves and stay present even in very multicultural Canada today. What do you think that says?
Sadly, I think it says that we have a legacy of hatred and bias in this country that we need to be aware of and need to continue to struggle against. Whether we can overcome it in the long term remains to be seen. But the right wing, the extreme right wing, the Klan and similar organizations have got a true and proven ability to take advantage of technology, to tell their story to willing ears and willing listeners, and we need to be aware of that and deal with it as we find it. As I say, hate has a place, hate had an address, and sadly, I think hate is present in this country in ways that we probably wish it wasn't, but it is.
That's Carleton University professor Allan Bartley, whose book, The Ku Klux Klan in Canada, A Century of Promoting Racism and Hate in the Peaceable Kingdom, is a real revelation, I think, to many of us who had no idea that the Klan had this kind of presence in our country. Thanks so much for coming on to TVO tonight and telling us about it, Allan. Appreciate it.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.